Okay, I'd like to start talking about looping in PHP by covering the for loop. The for loop, if you look at the documentation is actually really good on the for loop for PHP. I'm going to bring up my browser and have a look at it. The documentation for PHP identifies the for loop as being the most complex of the loops in PHP. And they say it's because it behaves like their C counterparts. And if you look at the syntax of a for loop, you'll probably recognize it if you've worked in other languages. It's pretty common the way that it's formatted. But if you've never seen it before, it could be a little confusing to look at. So I'd like to cover sort of the basics of it and show you exactly what all these expressions are in the parentheses. If you look down here at this example that they've got for you, this is the most common looking for loop that you've seen, where you've got multiple expressions in parentheses, and then the curly braces with a representation of one or more expressions that get evaluated during the course of each iteration of the loop. So back up here at the documentation, it explains to you what each of these three expressions are. The first expression, which is represented here by expression 1, is evaluated and executed once, unconditionally, at the beginning of the loop. So oftentimes you're going to use this first expression to sort of initialize a variable that's going to be observed over each one of these iterations. And then it says here, in the beginning of each of these iterations, expression 2 is then evaluated. If it's evaluated to true, the loop continues, and the nested statements, these are the statements in the curly braces, are executed. If it evaluates to false, the execution of the loop ends. And then at the end of each iteration, expression number 3, the final one here in parentheses, is evaluated. So take a look down here at the example that's provided in the documentation. You'll see this is pretty standard if you've looked at any sort of programming language. They first initialize a variable of I, they set it to 1, and they say that the condition of the loop is to continue if I is less than or equal to 10. After each iteration, however, they jump the I variable up by 1 with the I++ syntax here. So if I starts at 1, at the end of that first iteration, this third expression gets evaluated, and I gets set from 1 to 2, and then the loop begins again. Right? Then I is evaluated to be less than or equal to 10. In the case of the number 2, that is true. So it'll echo 1. And then at the end, it'll increment again by 1 and bring that value from 2 to 3. So it's a little confusing to kind of talk through it. So let's instead go back to our IDE and try it out. Let's see what we can do here. So we'll initialize a variable inside of our for loop. I'll just go ahead and set the skeleton structure of it here, right? And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, let's initialize a variable called x, and we'll set that to 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if x is less than 11, then we want to continue with our loop. And then what we do at the end of each of these loops is we increment x by 1 using the plus syntax. So what we'll do is similar to the example that we saw in the documentation. We'll just go ahead and we'll output that number. Actually, we'll do this. We'll output x, but then we'll use the concatenation operator, and we'll output a break tag in HTML right after it, just so that we can see each one of these numbers on a new line. So if we're initializing this variable and we're setting it to 1, and we're saying go ahead and continue so long as x is less than 11, and then we increment after each iteration, what we're saying is basically output the numbers 1 through 10 and then onto the screen, breaking after each one. So I'll save that. We'll run over to our browser and just make sure this is working. And it is. So that's a pretty basic, straightforward example. I think it's pretty close to what you saw in the documentation for PHP. Let's do something that's a little bit different. Give you an idea of exactly how you can use this in your code. We'll do something different here by setting an array. So what we'll do is we'll set an array and we'll call it names. We'll use the short syntax for initializing an array that you saw in a previous video. And we'll set 5 string values here. And these will just be names. So we'll make these quick names like Sam, Jim, Bob, Earl, and Joe. These are our names. So the names array consists of 5 strings, each of them a name. And what we want to do is we want to iterate over these names. And we'll do that using a for loop. Okay, I'll set my skeleton structure here, which is basically the for, with my parentheses that'll hold my 3 expressions, and then my curly braces, which will do all the work for each of these iterations, each of these times that we loop over here. So we'll set a variable to I. We'll initialize it as 0. I'll explain to you why we're going to do that in a minute. And we'll say if I is less than 5. We'll increment after each iteration by 1 using the plus plus syntax. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to echo. We'll say the name is. We'll use the concatenation operator again. And we'll say, let's look at the array called names. And the index, instead of using a number like 1 or 2 or even 0, will instead reference the variable I that we're initializing in our loop. So I represents the index of the array called names in this case. And then, to make it easy to read, we'll include the HTML new line break. And we'll say that's going to be it. So I'm looking this over. It doesn't look like I've got any syntax errors. What I want is I want to make sure that I'm outputting each of these names on their own line. So let me explain to you why I'm initializing this the way that I am. We know that arrays start with a 0 index. They do not start with 1. So if I'm going to reach into the names array, then I want to make sure that I'm starting with an index of 0. I want Sam to be the first thing that we output. If I were to start it with a 1, as we were looping over this array, it would reach into Jim, because Jim will be in the 1 index. Sam will be in 0. So we initialize I as 0. Now we've got 5 names in this array, but I'm saying that we only want to continue to iterate if I is less than 5, meaning 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the reason for that is because since we're starting with an array that's got an index of 0, we'll never get higher than 4, because Sam is 0, Jim is 1, Bob is 2, Earl is 3, and Joe is 4. So we want to make sure that we're looking at less than 5. So we're going to go 0 through 4. And then we're doing I++ because we're incrementing by 1. We want to make sure that we increment by 1 so that we can get every single one of these names output to the screen. So I'll show you that. With that explanation, you should sort of expect that this is going to work. I'm kind of feeling good about it myself. Let's have a look. And sure enough, it does. So let's show you how it would look if we did things a little bit differently. Let's say, for example, we said we want to make sure that we iterate if I is less than or equal to 5. That actually means that it'll attempt to reach into the names array and pull an index of 5. But no such index exists. So in some languages, you might see an exception get thrown to the screen. In the case of PHP, I think it's going to be a little bit lenient, right? And it doesn't throw an exception. It does show you that there is, in fact, no name to render to the screen because there is no index 5 in that array. Let's do something a little bit differently as well. Let's say we'll keep jumping over if we iterate, or if we're less than 5, but we're going to, instead of incrementing by 1, we'll say let's do this. We'll say I equals I plus 2. That means that we'll start with 0, but we'll add 2, so we're not going to actually jump over each one of these guys, or jump and retrieve each one of these guys. We're going to skip over some of them. That should make it look a little bit different. And sure enough, it does. Sam, Bob, and Joe are the only ones that get picked up in that case. So the behavior of your loop can change based on the parameters that you're setting here in each of these 3 expressions. So obviously, you can loop over different collection types, and your looping can have other purposes, but that kind of gives you the basics. And what we'll do is we'll cover additional looping constructs outside of the for loop in subsequent videos.